There are a lot of great acts in wrestling who, for one reason or another, just never lived up to the potential they had. Of course, reasons for this can vary. Sometimes it's the fault of the bookers, and sometimes it's the fault of the performers themselves. But the end result is always the same: wrestlers who could have been more, but just weren't. But who are the most notable examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now. And where better to start than with the Hurt Business? Yes, during their brief run on Raw during the early 2020s, they were easily one of the best things on the show. Unfortunately though, they never seemed to reach the heights they could have. Yes, for as much as many fans got behind this stable of well-dressed ass kickers who included Bobby Lashley, MVP, Shelton Benjamin, and Cedric Alexander, there was always a sense that they could have been more. And that was why, even at their peak, when 3 of the 4 were draped in gold, they never felt like the dominating force on Raw that they should have been. Hell, you would have thought that holding both the WWE title and the Raw Tag Team titles simultaneously would have been enough to make them the Red Brand's equivalent of the Bloodline back then, but this was not to be. Rather, they always felt like Bloodline Light, as the Hurt Business never really had the same quality of storytelling that Roman and his family had. And once Benjamin and Alexander lost those tag team titles, things fell apart for the stable completely, as this was when Lashley and MVP kicked the latter two out of the group, pretty much relegating the whole thing to a two-man show. Still, at least they got that big revival later down the line, right? Well, not quite, because despite a brief reunion in September of 2021, that never really came to fruition. In fact, if MVP is to be believed, he was told there was no intention of WWE bringing the Hurt Business back, meaning our chances of seeing them reach their potential as a group were 0 to none. But hope remains yet, as with Lashley now a free agent, and with both MVP and Shelton Benjamin both currently being able to go wherever they want, there's a chance we'll see the group reform in a different company before all is said and done, where they can finally achieve everything they're capable of. It's just a shame we're unlikely going to be able to say the same about our next team, Enzo and Big Cass. That's right, cast your minds back to the mid-2010s for a moment. It was often a rough time to be a fan of wrestling, but there were occasional glimmers of light which shone, and one of those great glimmers was a homegrown act in WWE in the form of Enzo and Big Cass. What made these two tri-state area performers so engaging? Well, they had excellent chemistry for one, with both complementing each other perfectly, as Enzo served as trash talker of the group, all while Cass played the role of the heavy. And at least at first, during their time down on NXT, this chemistry helped the pair to get over in a major way with fans. That said, things would all change in 2016, as this was when they were called up to the main roster and suddenly found themselves being booked by Vince McMahon. That's right, you can probably guess what happened next. Bad Creative quickly nerfed Enzo and Cass, as rather than be a potential top tag team in the division, they were almost immediately slotted into the role of wrestlers there to do the job to more established teams for the most part. And because this brought any momentum they'd been building to a dead stop, it would be in 2017 that WWE decided to split the pair up, taking away any hopes we might have had of them ever regaining momentum and winning those elusive tag team titles. Still, it wasn't all bad after that though, right? After all, at least Enzo went on to become Cruiserweight Champion. Well, yes, that's true, but not many fans watched the Cruiserweight division in the late 2010s. And as for Big Cass's solo run, well, this went even worse, enough to where he'd be fired in the summer of 2018, just a few months following Enzo's own firing. And since leaving WWE behind, both men have gone on separate paths, with Enzo primarily working in MLW, and Big Cass moving over to AEW, where he finally won Tag Team Gold alongside Ricky Starks. But let's move away from tag team acts for a moment and on to single stars, as there's plenty of wasted potential to be found there too. And few places is this more evident in than with our next subject, Cara. That's right, it doesn't matter which version of Cara we're talking about, the first or the second, this is a gimmick which really should have been more in WWE. After all, both incarnations were played by highly accomplished wrestlers who'd made a name for themselves in Mexico before they ever made it to Vince McMahon's company, with one of these being one of the biggest stars in modern lucha history. So what went wrong once they moved north of the border then? Well, a few things. First of all, there was the fact that while their lucha theatrics worked perfectly in places like AAA and CMLL, after arriving in WWE and being asked to change their style of work, neither Jose Rodriguez or Luis Alvarez had much luck in adapting to this new environment. And this led to numerous situations where rather than shining upon hitting the ring on SmackDown, they became known for their botches above all else. And then there's the fact that, particularly with Místico's portrayal of Sin Cara, he knew how much star power he had south of the border and could return there if things didn't go to plan. So it should come as little surprise then that with all these factors coming together, he'd find few friends backstage. And because of that, the first Sin Cara would be gone for good, all while the new version was relegated to the role of tag team partner to Kalisto in the Lucha Dragons, a team who were never really treated like a serious threat. Could they have been more? Absolutely. But this was not to be in the end, just as reaching the huge potential that was available to them was not to be for our next subject either, Damen Sandow. Of course, in Sandow's case, his failure to live up to the potential he had in WWE can't be blamed on him, as he always made the best of what he was given. And as if that wasn't enough, he never seemed to have any issues backstage with anyone. So what went wrong in this case? Well, likely bad booking was the problem here, as for most of his run in WWE, the Massachusetts native wasn't given enough to work with. Sure, he would win the Money in the Bank contract in 2013, but the less said about the cash-in attempt which followed that, the better. And after this, he'd be stuck playing the role of guy who cosplayed as other people for a while, but even then, Damen Sandow was good enough to get this over, as when he started acting as The Miz's stunt double in the summer of 2014, the now rebranded Damien Mizdow quickly became a breakout cult sensation in WWE. At least that saw him finally get recognized for the talent he was then, right? Well, not quite, because while fans were certainly behind him, as soon as Mizdow turned on The Miz at WrestleMania 31, rather than being given a run as a serious challenger, he was instead thrown right back down into the undercard, the very place he would remain until finally being released from his contract in 2016. Yes, it's a sad state of affairs that despite audiences being more than ready for it, Vince McMahon just never chose to pull the trigger on Damen Sandow for one reason or another. And as a result of this decision, it means the former Mr. Money in the Bank will always go down as a case of what could have been. But he's not the biggest what could have been in WWE history, as an arguably even bigger example of that can be found in our next subject, Ahmed Johnson. Yes, if you were watching WWF during the point the company was changing over from the New Generation era to the Attitude Era, then you'll no doubt remember Ahmed Johnson, someone who at one point seemed poised to be the next top babyface of the promotion. So much potential did he seem to have, in fact, it felt like it was a given he was going to be at the top of the card for years to come. But as we all know now, that didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen was mostly because of the Indiana native. What did he do to stop his growth to the top of the card? Well, how about the fact that he continually got injured, something which eventually gave management pause about continuing to push him. Seriously, every time the Pearl River Powerhouse started building serious momentum between 1995 and 1997, it seemed like something would happen that would put him on the shelf. And when he wasn't getting injured, he was often injuring his opponents, with this doing little to endear him to the locker room. So even if he came close a few times, Johnson was never quite able to fully break into that main event scene in WWF, and he was certainly never able to win the WWF title. Now, instead of reaching his full potential and going all the way to the top as a modern version of the Ultimate Warrior, the one-time Intercontinental Champion eventually sputtered and stalled so much that fans gave up on him. And when this happened, it truly was over for him, enough to where, by early 1998, right as the Attitude Era was about to properly begin, he'd part ways with the company and instead make the jump over to WCW right at the point they were starting their own death spiral. But not every example of someone leaving WWE after their potential was wasted has been a bad move, and this can clearly be seen in our next subject, Gail Kim. Now we know Gail Kim certainly proved how great she could be in places like TNA, so to say her potential was wasted there would be insincere. But when it comes to her time in WWE specifically, it's undeniable that they missed the ball on her big time. Why is that? Well, they took someone who was easily one of the best women's wrestlers in the world at the time and had her do little to nothing. Yes, Kim was a one-time women's champion in WWE, but, like with the tag team titles, this wasn't a belt which was treated with much prestige back then. And so, holding said belt did little to elevate the Toronto native then. No, what she really needed was an opportunity to show what she could do in the ring, something she was not going to get under Vince McMahon's watch at that time. It didn't matter if it was her first run there between 2000 and 2004, or her second run between 2008 and 2011, Gail Kim never got the opportunities she deserved. So bad did things get for her, in fact, during her final go-around, she'd infamously walk out on the promotion mid-match when she eliminated herself from a battle royal and never returned. Sure, she was recognized for her skills elsewhere, but back then, WWE was the only big league in town, and so if you really wanted to get noticed on a larger scale, it was going to have to be there. And when it came to Gail Kim, much to the frustration of both her and her fans, this recognition would never come in WWE, meaning her time there can't be considered anything less than a waste of potential. But what of one of her peers, someone she shared the ring with in a variety of places? Well, that would be our next subject as it happens, Mickie James, and her second run in WWE between 2016 and 2021. Yes, during Mickie James' first run in WWE during the early 2000s, she was able to get noticed by both fans and management. So when we talk about her potential being wasted, we're not talking about this period, as it certainly wouldn't apply. What we are talking about instead is her second go-around with Vince McMahon's promotion. Why are we talking about this run? Well, because it sticks out like a sore thumb that Mickie would fail to be utilized to the fullest of her potential here, as, in theory, it should have been the point she was treated like a returning legend. After all, by this time, she was a bona fide superstar in women's wrestling, what with her being a 9-time world champion and all. And it wasn't just her title wins which made her a legend either. No, there was also the string of classic bouts she's had too, many of which happened within the WWE. So you'd think that her return here would have been treated like a big deal, except it wasn't. No, instead of promoting James as a star on the level of Trish Stratus or Lita here, she would instead play the role of lackey to Alexa Bliss, firmly slotting her in the position of someone you shouldn't think of as too big of a deal. And because of this then, this is exactly the way fans treated her, and that led to not much of note for the Virginia native. Sure, she would eventually get to have a feud with Bliss, a feud which allowed her to show some babyface fire again, but this was far below the level the former women's champion should have been at during this point in her career. Rather, what she could have been doing here was working with Sasha Banks and Charlotte Flair in title programs and using her experience to help put them over to the next level. Hell, she could have gotten another run with the women's title, as she was certainly still able to carry a division, something her subsequent runs as Knockouts champion in TNA showed. But then our next subject could have also had title reigns of their own. Who are we talking about here? Sanity. Now again, like with Mickie James, we have to add a caveat to this one, as we know Sanity had a pretty good run down on NXT between 2016 and 2018. That said, the same could not be said of their time on the main roster. No, that was where things really fell apart for them. What happened? Well, like with so many other examples at that time, bad booking was the culprit, as once they made it up to SmackDown, they'd find themselves being booked by Vince McMahon instead of Triple H. And this meant instead of being presented as a stable of psychopaths who destroyed everything and everyone they came up against, Sanity were now treated as jobbers to the stars, a group who were beaten soundly by the New Day on their pay-per-view debut at Extreme Rules 2018. Obviously then, this quickly set the tone for where things would be going, and as if that wasn't enough, there was also the fact Nikki Cross was removed from the group too here, making them feel like even less of the unit they'd been down in developmental. Still, at least they could have recovered somewhat had the now trio of Young, Wolf, and Dane been allowed to build themselves back up and show a main roster audience what they were capable of. Sadly though, this would never happen, as they'd never get enough TV time to do so. That's right, between 2018 and 2019, they'd only make a handful of appearances on the Blue brand, with those appearances usually seeing them staring up at the lights by time all was said and done. And by the spring of 2019, it would be all over for Sanity, as they'd split up entirely, never getting their chance to meet their full potential on the WWE main roster because of this. And what a crime that is, because they really could have been something had they been given the chance to shine. But it's not like this is the first time such a thing has happened for a team in WWE, as a couple of years prior, the same thing was happening with our next subjects, the Vaud Villains. Yes, while the team of Aiden English and Simon Gotch were not likely going to be main eventers, at least not under the gimmick of two old-timey performers from the carnival circuit, there was still a lot more that could have been done with them within the WWE system between 2014 and 2017. So what went wrong then? It's hard to pinpoint one precise moment exactly, rather it was just a combination of a lot of little things. For one, there was the fact that yes, while the gimmick was fun, it was certainly limiting, and it was the kind of thing which wouldn't have looked out of place during the New Generation era. So there was always going to be a sense that for as talented as English and Gotch were, they were going to struggle to break through the glass ceiling while in their Vaud Villains guise. Really then, with all that in mind, it's not surprising the Vaud Villains failed to live up to their potential. Sure, attempts would be made to do something with them. Hell, at one point, while still down in NXT, they'd become tag team champions for a short period. But there was never any attempt at a sustained push for the duo even down in the Black and Gold brand, especially not after better teams like DIY, American Alpha, and The Revival came along. And as far as their main roster run was concerned, that had even less fanfare attached to it there. English and Gotch would mostly do jobs to more established duos, a position they found themselves stuck in all the way up until the team was split in April of 2017 after the latter got fired. What happened after that? Well, Aiden English eventually found a nice role for himself as the Herald of Rusev. But as far as the Vaud Villains were concerned, they'd never get another chance, just as our next subject never got another chance in WWE after his failed run back in the early to mid-2000s. Who are we talking about here? Why, Mark Gindra, of course. That's right, Mark Gindra. What could have been? After all, this was a man who very nearly was the fourth member of Evolution, a spot he would have taken from Dave Bautista if things had worked out differently. But alas, things didn't work out as they might have in this universe, and so instead of being rocketed towards the glitz and glamour of superstardom and WrestleMania main events, the New York native turned into a poster boy for someone who never quite lived up to his potential, unfortunately. And what potential he had, because as far back as his early days in WCW, it was clear Gindra had a certain quality to him which would have made him an apparent shoo-in for success under a Vince McMahon. After all, he was big and muscular and he could carry himself in the ring, something his 2 runs as WCW World Tag Team Champion alongside Sean O'Haire showed. Hell, it even seemed like when he joined WWF in 2001 as part of the Invasion, he was going to manage to avoid the pitfall of being labeled a mere WCW guy. But as we all know now, well, he almost broke through when Evolution started in 2003. Apparent personality clashes with the rest of the group stopped his role there from going any further. And once that happened, any hopes of Mark breaking out from the pack quickly evaporated. So it was then that what remained of his career following this would take place mostly on the SmackDown brand, with the big man there serving the role of heavy to Kurt Angle alongside Luther Reigns, a far cry from the position it was at one point hoped he'd find himself in. Would he do any better once his time in WWE came to an end in 2005? Not quite, as aside from working in Mexico for a while, Mark Gindra never really got another bite at the apple in a major promotion. But then at least he's not alone in never reaching his full potential inside a wrestling ring, as the exact same thing could be said about everyone else we've looked at today.